and welcome to the latest NGV Adult Learning Series, Observations, Dress in Art and Design History. My name is Donna McComb and I'm the Assistant Director of Curatorial and Audience Engagement here at the NGV. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people as the traditional owners of the land on which the NGV stands and from where I am speaking with you today. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be joining us today. The NGV has an internationally significant collection, which we are thrilled to highlight and explore with you throughout this series. Across 3 engaging sessions, we are delighted to welcome the contributions of a range of preeminent researchers, curators and scholars from around the world. Using key works from the NGV collection, presenters will uncover the many ways that the act and art of dressing has influenced and captured key moments in art and design history. It is wonderful to welcome you all today to our first session, The Politics of Dress, covering the period 1500 to the 1900s. In this session, we will consider how dress reflected societal ideas and change across a period of 400 years. We will consider the emergence of radical new styles of dress for both men and women, discover how portrait sitters conferred their power through their dress, and we will explore what Jane Austen wore and discuss subcultures that challenge societal stereotypes. We are thrilled that you can join us for this fascinating and enlightening series of presentations. We will now begin our first presentation, and I hope that you enjoy today's session and thank you for joining us.
Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Ted Gott and I'm Senior Curator of International Art at the National Gallery of Victoria. I'm delighted now to introduce the speaker of this event, Breeze Barrington. Breeze is a cultural historian specialising in the artistic cultures of the 17th century, with particular focus on women's history and female artists. She teaches literature at the University of Cambridge. As an arts writer and critic, she is a regular contributor to Apollo magazine, the Art newspaper, the Financial Times and the Times Literary Supplement. She is an Associate Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and her first book, The Graces, will be published by Bloomsbury in 2025. Breeze will be presenting Power Dressing, the Art of Style in Tudor and Stuart Portraiture. The 16th and 17th centuries saw a flourishing of portraiture. This medium provided the perfect opportunity for rich courtiers to display their wealth and magnificence. Dripping in their finest jewels and extravagantly colourful silks, velvets, brocaded tunics, dresses and gloves, these aristocratic sitters still stare arrestingly out at us centuries after they lived. This talk will look at the development of power dressing portraits over 100 years in Britain, and we'll look at how this genre shaped and was shaped by society. Welcome, Breeze.
Hello, and thank you for joining me. And thank you to the National Gallery of Victoria for inviting me to present this session. So today I'm going to be talking to you about portraiture between around 1570 and 1680, and I'll primarily be looking at portraits made in Britain. The world of portraiture in Tudor and Stuart England really has no equivalent in today's world. The kinds of self-fashioning of images that we maybe see on social media could be seen as a relic of this type of image making, but it's still a very long way from the deeply codified portraits that were popular amongst, and indeed were only available to, the elites of the late 16th and 17th centuries. These portraits aimed to show the viewer the status, the power, and the wealth of the sitter they were looking at. These portraits, the domain of the rich, were sites of display in more than one sense of the word. So when we look at these paintings, 400 or even 500 years after they were created, we need to ask of them, what are you showing me? What is it that you want me to see? What do you display? And the clues are all there to be found. Let us look, for example, at this first painting by Antonis More, a Netherlandish painter who worked across Europe, but particularly worked for King Philip II of Spain. So this image here, which is dated around 1555 to 1560, is painted of an unknown woman. And whilst we may never know her name, we can discover a lot about her just from looking at this image. So at first glance, it seems like a sombre piece. The viewer stands at three-quarter, looks out of the canvas, and meets the viewer's gaze with an unyielding stare. She's dressed in a jet black dress with minimal details, though there are dark red sleeves coming out to cover the forearms. She wears a linen collar and cuffs. She wears a white hood to match. In one hand, she clasps a large chain, which is looped around her waist. It's almost like a belt. And in the other hand, she holds a clean white handkerchief. The background is plain, dark, austere. And indeed, this whole image is austere. It was probably painted when Moore was living in Brussels or in Utrecht, and the kind of clothes in the portrait are characteristic of this part of the world at the time, which was heavily influenced by Spanish fashions. These Spanish fashions called for a kind of sombre and austere dress, something simple and unadorned. But it is a misleading simplicity. Let us look again, starting with the weighty gold chain that this woman holds. She holds it high up around her, but we still can't quite see the end. For the viewer, the chain is of an endless length, and it symbolizes her boundless wealth. And it was no doubt very heavy to wear. But this is very little consideration for a sitter like this. She does not need to work, or to walk, or indeed to do anything. And that is what the painting tells us. Now, black was a very costly dye, and this black of the dress is very, very deep and rich. The colour usually faded quickly. It was only worn by those who could afford it, and it would only be worn for the finest of occasions, such perhaps as sitting for your portrait. Let us look closer again at the dress beyond the colour, at the material. It has a light sheen to it. Within the darkness of the background and of the fabric, it seems to catch an unseen source of light. And this source of light sits in contrast to the stripes of velvet which draw down the bodice and down the upper sleeves. Let us look too at the way the sleeves puff around the shoulders, the height of fashion. Look at how the sleeves, which puff at the top, make way for that rich, deep red velvet which tightly adorns the forearms. The lace cuffs around the wrists are pleated. And now this would have been no small feat, for every one of those narrow folds will have been ironed into place by hard-working servants, as will the pleated ruff collar, which rises out from under the high neckline of the dress. Now, ruffs were really in their infancy at this stage, but as we will soon see, they were about to reach their pinnacle. The lace hood that she wears too is of intricate workmanship, and its style is really one of the things that places this portrait in the Netherlands rather than in England, where Moore had recently been to create the painting, the marriage portrait for Queen Mary I, to be given to her respective and future husband, Philip II of Spain. Let us turn now to another painting from across the water in England. This one is dated 1570, and we can see here how the ruff is progressing. So by this point, it's no longer attached to the collar. It is an entirely separate garment, and this one is an impressive piece of workmanship. The discovery of starch in the 1560s really allowed the ruff to take on a life of its own, and it began to take pride of place in the outfits of fashionable courtiers. Aside from this having a more developed ruff, there are actually several parallels with Moore's sitter. She too is unidentified, but now so is the painter. She too wears a tightly buttoned up collar and holds a similarly unsmiling gaze in semi-profile. And though her expression is arguably a little softer, she's clearly a woman to be reckoned with. Her pale dress is embroidered with a gold thread horizontally, an intricate and time-consuming process to create. And over the top of it, she wears a kind of doublet. This is black, again, this expensive dye, with a silver embroidery which follows that same horizontal striped pattern as the dress. It almost looks like a suit of armour. And this impression is highlighted by the exquisite gold buttons, which are embossed and stand on top of the doublet. The coif at the back of her head is almost like a helmet as well, in that it is so adorned with gold and jewels that it seems to be more metal than fabric. And this one sits far back on her head, so as to emphasize her golden red hair, which thereby establishes a connection between herself and her monarch, Elizabeth I. Now, at this point, Elizabeth had been on the throne for around a decade, and she was in her late 30s. But she had not given in to pressure from her ministers to marry, and she continued to reign in her own right. But in doing so, she walked a tightrope. And we'll talk more about how she used her image to her own advantage. But it's important here in this portrait to think a little about how she controlled the appearances of those around her. So sumptuary laws, which dictated which colours and which fabrics every class of society could wear, had been active in England for quite a long time. But here in the 1570s, Elizabeth I revisited the already stringent code and added a number of clauses of extra constraints. And one of these clauses can tell us a lot about this unidentified sitter. It says, "None shall wear any cloth of gold, tissue, nor fur of sables, except duchesses, marquises, and countesses in their gowns, kirtles, partlets, and sleeves." And it goes on to say that this also includes cloth of gold, silver, or embroidered with gold, silver, or pearl. We can see the embroidery of gold and silver, of the pearls, all here in this image. So this figure must therefore be a duchess, a marquise, or a countess. She is high society. The rules also apply to velvet, to chains, to buttons, enamel, jewels, many of which we see in this image, and which are also found in this next portrait, a painting of Elizabeth I's great favourite, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Now, one of the things that's interesting to note is that there's actually very little in this portrait that is notably different from those of the other two women we've just seen. His doublet is buttoned high around his neck, and his small buttons are enamel rather than jewelled. The other women had gold buttons. He wears his ruff slightly open at the neck, and it's attached to the collar rather than a standalone object. And instead of wearing the sort of the hood or the coif, he wears a black velvet cap. As we said, this material was reserved for high aristocracy and royalty, and it's that expensive dye again. And out of it comes a lustrous red feather and a large gemstone. But in essentials, his outfit is not so different, and the pose is very much the same. These paintings also share one key detail. They are all objects of splendour and of display. They're a display of wealth, of fashion, of status. They are designed to show anybody who is lucky enough to get to see this painting that these sitters embody all of those coveted qualities. Portraits, then, were objects of self-fashioning. They were propaganda. And really nobody harnessed the potentials given by this kind of image more than Elizabeth I. There were copious images made of the Virgin Queen, and each of them were carefully crafted by her. Now, she did this in part, this kind of image making, because her legitimacy as queen was often called into question. So firstly, she was a woman, and at this time, it wasn't thought that women would be capable of ruling. And indeed, her sister, Mary I, who'd reigned before her, had only reigned for a few short years, so she provided very little precedent. Now, as a child, Elizabeth had been declared illegitimate when her mother was accused of adultery and executed for that crime. As an adult, Elizabeth had refused to marry, so she had no heir. Her long reign was punctuated with plots and with fears of usurpation. So she, more than anyone, had to constantly convince court and country that she was a legitimate monarch. And she did this through the cultivation of her image. Now, this engraving, which comes from the National Gallery of Victoria's collection, is clearly recognisable. It's a very classic image of Elizabeth I. She wears the wide farthingale skirt, the huge heart-shaped wire veil, which was known as a headrail, and these came into fashion around the 1590s. She's got this very large ruff surrounding this sort of ageless face, though she was an aging queen. The dress was covered in pearls and perhaps rubies and emeralds too. It's difficult to tell in black and white. And of course, all of these gems would have been sewn to the dress by hand, which would have been an incredibly time-consuming process to make. And in fact, for the queen to even be dressed like this, it would have taken hours of preparation. So first on would have been the plain, sort of loose-fitting kind of slip, and she'd have worn stockings over her legs, which would have been held up probably with ribbons or with garters. After this first layer came the corset, The corset would be made probably with wood or with metal or with bone, so these sort of long sticks to support the torso. After this, a petticoat would be fashioned to the waist before the elaborate farthingale wheel was added on top. Then would come the skirts of the dress, tied around the waist. Over the top of this, an object called a drum ruffle. And this was sort of the same patterning as the skirt, and it basically softened the lines around the top of the skirt to make the sort of the transition from waist to material cleaner. The bodice of the dress would be put over the top of that, and that would then get hooked onto the skirts. Now, this bodice would have a sort of triangular stomacher pinned onto the inside, which would give it a strong definition. And this, again, may be made of bone, or perhaps of pasteboard, or a kind of thick, strong canvas. These bodices were cut very low, and they gave the impression of this very lengthy torso. They overhang quite strongly at the bottom, and they sort of end in a bit of a peak, as you see here. Now, Elizabeth often wore a sort of pearl hanging from the end of this, pearls as a symbol of virginity, and obviously placing it there really accentuates this. The sleeves of this dress, which were sometimes called farthingale sleeves or cannon sleeves, even trunk sleeves, today we might call them leg of mutton sleeves, these would be attached separately again. They would be hooked onto the bodice. And attached to these, we see that she has these jewel-studded sort of drapes of cloth. They were called hanging sleeves. And again, they were attached separately on top of the other sleeves. At this point, this sort of big rope of pearls would have been placed around her neck. It's a big, heavy thing, which almost completely covers all of that cleavage, which has been left on show by the low bodice. It's another sort of part of the dress, really. Her earrings, too, probably went in now, while access to the ears was still quite easy, because after this point, the ruff went on. Now, this one is called a cartwheel ruff, and you can see why. It's a sort of huge, long, wide object. And this would be attached to the bodice. This is probably the biggest ruff that you would see at the time, because nobody should get to have a ruff bigger than the Queen. This one might be around 600 pleats or so. Each of them would be starched by hand. And after the 1590s, it was quite usual for ruffs to be worn open like this rather than that closed one that we saw before. Now, once the ruff was on, the headrail would be secured behind it. So the headrail is a slightly easier, it's a more malleable object. And once it was attached, it could be bent into whatever shape was required. So it might be made to look like wings, or in the case of this one, almost like a heart. So Elizabeth would then have her wig put on, and all the jewels and the pearls that you see would probably already have been attached to it. The wig was used, especially at the end of Elizabeth's reign, as a way of making her look younger. She probably had very little hair. It certainly wouldn't have been this bright sort of golden orange that she had in her youth. So it's all part of her image making, her myth making, her regalia. The crown will have gone on last, and her feet would have been squeezed into heeled shoes. And then when she was handed that orb and scepter, she was finally ready to go. Now let's just take a moment to think about what it would feel like to wear all of those clothes. Just the weight of that jeweled fabric alone, let alone the layer upon layer underneath, all of which is designed to sort of contort and to hold the body into the exact posture that we see here. And Elizabeth might have worn this outfit for hours upon end. Now, she never went out in public without this regalia, though in private she was reportedly much more sedate in her choice of attire. So her 17th century biographer, Edmund Bowen, reported that she loved a prudent and moderate habit in her private apartment and conversations with her own servants. It's perhaps little wonder that a prudent and moderate habit was preferable in comparison to this heavy, tight, cumbersome object. But this is something we will come back to throughout this 100 years of fashion and portraits that we're going to look at today, that these clothes were not meant to be practical. In fact, they're deliberately not practical. The wearers are royal, they're aristocratic, they are eye-wateringly wealthy. They don't need to move, to walk, to work. And this is what they want to show us. It is all part of this image making and this myth making. Now, Bowen's account went further. He went on to talk about when she appeared in public, she was ever richly adorned with the most valuable clothes, and set off again with much gold and jewels of inestimable value. And on such occasions she ever wore high shoes, that she might seem taller than indeed she was. The first day of the Parliament, she would appear in a robe embroidered with pearls, the royal crown upon her head, the golden ball in her left hand, and the sceptre in her right. And as she never failed then of the loud acclamations of her people, so she was ever pleased with it, and went into the house in a kind of triumph, with all the ensigns of majesty. Now, Bowen could not have been writing from life. He was only born in 1646, and in fact this account wasn't published until 1693, 90 years after the death of Queen Elizabeth. But this vivid account would seem to replicate this engraving that we have here by Crispin de Passe after a watercolour sketch by Isaac Oliver, which is now held in the British Royal Collection. So we've seen how the Queen was richly adorned with these jewels of inestimable value, the valuable clothes set off with gold, the pearls, the royal crown, the orb, the sceptre, the ensigns of majesty. The image that this print was made for does not have any of the surrounding images that we see in this print. And the print itself wasn't made or even circulated in the Queen's lifetime. It's dated from 1603, the year of her death, and that's alluded to in the left-hand side of the image with the line, Mortua anno misericordiae, died in the year of mercy. Other additions to the print include the sword on the Bible, which symbolise her role as head of the church and invokes her father's title of Defender of the Faith, a symbol which is emphasised in the coat of arms above with the line, Possui Deum auditorem, I have made God my helper. And another thing to note about the fact that this is a print, not a painting, is that it's intended for mass circulation. This is a kind of majesty and symbol of power that in fact transcends death. Through it, the image of the Queen is made immortal. So when Bowen says all of these things as though he saw her, it tells us that the mythologizing of the monarch, which started in her lifetime, was being perpetuated after her death in the first years of the next dynasty, the Stuarts. And it's to the Stuarts that we will now turn. So when James VI of Scotland became James I of England, he took a rather different approach to majesty. But he could. He was a man. He had a strong claim to the throne. He had experience of kingship, having been the King of Scotland for a long time. He was a Protestant. He already had an heir and a spare in his sons Henry and Charles, and he also had a daughter, Elizabeth, who could, and in fact would, be married advantageously. So he arrived in England essentially a ready-made king with family in tow. He would not have to fight for his legitimacy in the way that Elizabeth did. And with him too came a kind of relaxing of protocol, and this extended to fashion. So let us look at this image, this engraving of the new monarch, which dates from 1613. We see some of the trappings that we saw in the Elizabethan engraving, but it's a much more relaxed image. James wanted really to be seen as a scholar king, and he holds the sceptre as though it were a quill, as though he's been caught in a kind of moment of creation. And in place of a crown, he wears a laurel wreath. So in part here, he's playing on wearing the sort of the headgear of the emperors, but he's also playing with wearing a laurel crown given to the poets by gods in classical mythology. So this quill-like sceptre points down to writing below in this text, which praises this king who'd united the Britons, who brought laws to the land and education to the masses, the man of whom poets sing songs of praise. He united the sceptre and the laurel, it says. So in this image, he's also demonstrating that he's king and hero. The orb, which is sort of suspended beside him with these little wings, is surrounded by the phrase Honi sui qui mal y pense, the motto of the Knights of the Garter, which translates as shame be on anyone who thinks ill of it. Now, knights were allowed to display this phrase around their coats of arms in images of them, but here the monarch places it around his orb. And he's wearing his garter robes, a fur mantle, on top of which sits the garter chain, and the George pendant hangs down from it. This is an enamelled, jewelled, embossed image of St. George slaying the dragon. The Order of the Garter was the highest honour in the land, and it had actually been bestowed on James by Elizabeth I in 1590. The fact that he shows himself wearing this is a way of establishing a kind of continuity between Elizabeth and James's reign, that she has given him the honour, she's given him his legitimacy. Now, this image, like that one of Elizabeth that we spoke about before, is an engraving, hundreds, thousands of which were made. And this one, made a decade into James's reign, could be circulated to the masses. So if James used clothes and accessories to bolster the image of him as king for his people in the same way that Elizabeth had done, what were the people of his court doing? For the story of fashion in 16th and 17th century portraits is really two stories, that of the monarch and that of the court. So how were the Dudley equivalents presenting their images at this Stuart court? Images which were not aimed at the masses, but were not less powerful for it. They were to be viewed by a mixture of friends, important figures at court, perhaps even their monarch. They were opportunities to rise. Let's take this image of Mary, Lady Vere, by William Larkin, a painter who, for centuries after his death, was known only as the curtain master. And indeed, looking at these curtains, it's easy to see why. They're just one example of the incredible way that Larkin handled fabric. Just look at the intricacy of the lace in the ruff, the collar, the matching cuffs, such minute workmanship, both in terms of the fabric and its depiction. Every tiny strand and thread has been painted. You can really feel the weight of the velvet dress, another dress of costly black, and this weight is mirrored again in the weight of the tablecloth beside her. This tablecloth is again mirrored back in the dress in the red material, which sort of peeks out of the split front. It's embroidered with gold and silver thread, just like the material on the table. And look at these fabulous jeweled shoes that are worn here over some very brilliant blue stockings. These shoes are something of a trademark for Larkin, because this is what Larkin did best: clothes. The people in the painting are almost incidental, really, to these sumptuous silks, jewel-encrusted heels, bright, brilliant fabrics that just stand out on every one of his canvases. These huge canvases, which are bigger than life size, these are towering objects. Now, records show that part of his process meant that his subjects would come and sit for the painting just a few times, but they would send their clothes on afterwards to be painted at more of his leisure. So you can sort of imagine the high aristocracy of the Jacobean court picking out their best clothes to send on for their portrait. And the blue in these stockings shows just how rich this particular sitter was. It may even be ultramarine, a very, very expensive coveted dye, which was made from ground lapis lazuli. It was worth more than gold. But what made Larkin innovative was not so much the materials that he used, but the precision of the way that he applied the paint. So metallic leaf was never used, but instead he would use these sort of triple layers of brown, orange, yellow, if he was painting gold, or he would use sort of a dark grey, a light grey, and white if he was creating silver. And these layers of paint would literally stand up, layered out of the canvas, and they would catch the light as though they were real gems. They'd look like they were proper gems painted on. And since these paintings were viewed by candlelight, the effect must have been magnificent. But wonderful as this image is, it is a symbol of the last hurrah for this kind of portraiture. And it was also, incidentally, the last hurrah for the ruff, which began to droop before disappearing altogether. As we can see in this image by Van Dyck of Philip Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke, he's sporting what was called a drop collar or a falling collar. And the arrival of Van Dyck in London around 1621 marked a new cultural era for England. This was an England which was increasingly open to the latest innovations from the continent, and we can see this in the styles of painting. It was also a period of great change in fashion. So under James I, the sumptuary laws had been almost completely repealed. People could wear what they wanted. And replacing this kind of highly starched ruff, the heavy velvets, the tight doublets, the corseted bodices, we find instead luxurious flowing silks, flat collars on men, and often no collars at all on women. The figures don't stand in this sort of upright and austere manner, but they're relaxed, even languorous. We move more into the silks, into soft fabrics, away from thick velvets. Now, this Daniel Myton's portrait of John Ashburnham, who was familiarly called Jack by Charles I, to whom he worked as groom of the bedchamber, is a really wonderful example of this. So this outfit was very high fashion at the court of Charles I, where clothes were modelled on the French style. You can see this green doublet and breeches, which have this wonderful embroidery of red and silver threads and lace. It's expensive and it's intricate, but the fit is relaxed. He doesn't even have all the buttons of his doublet done up. He sports this kind of aristocratic negligence known as déchebelé, which we find from this time onwards. It's a long way from the buttoned-up aristocrats of the Tudor court. The fashions, too, are for this kind of slashed sleeve that you see, and it would display a sort of fantastic silk undershirt, sometimes of quite elaborate colours, though here we see a remarkably clean white one. And in fact, these shirts might be changed multiple times a day if they became marked. Having this clean shirt is a marker of your status. Ashburnham wears these shoes, which are called a boot hose, and they have this amazing heel. You can see it's sort of got an extra bit of material underneath, which is connected at the toe, and you can see it going back to the heel, but it's not attached to the heel. Now, this is called a slap sole, and it's because it would make a slapping sound as the wearer walked along, which for some reason was considered very desirable. Now, these boots are worn over stockings, which are trimmed with lace, and you can see them there. They come out at the top and then they fold down over the top of the boot. The boots look of very high quality leather. It looks very, very soft, and they have a sort of snazzy bit attached to the front that's really there to connect these long gold spurs that you see at the back. Now, this is slightly peculiar. These spurs are suggestive of armour, but clearly this outfit is a very long way from anything that would reasonably be worn in battle. But actually, a closer look at the image, you can see all around Ashburnham are these pieces of armour. They've been sort of scattered and discarded. And the sword that he wears behind his back. You can only really see the top of the hilt and a tiny bit of the bottom. He's not about to fight. Now, the messaging going on in this painting, which is definitely there, is quite unclear. What's unclear as well is the way that he's skewered his discarded glove by his foot on the ground. Gloves were an important fashion piece. Any courtier worth his salt should never be seen without gloves at the Caroline court. And portraits were full of men wearing one glove and casually holding another. So the fact that he's wearing one glove isn't unusual, but the fact that he's skewering the other one with a sort of stick perhaps is. Now, gloves were not functional, they were ornamental, and these gloves were very fine indeed. They look to be the same soft leather as the boots, but they're beautifully embroidered with a kind of silk gold thread. And we can actually see a lovely example of gloves which are very similar to this from the National Gallery collection. These French fashions were found even more readily among the women of the court. Queen Henrietta Maria was famously fashion conscious, and she spent copious amounts of money on the latest continental styles, which was much to the disapproval of a growing Puritan population. Fashion became something of a battleground, though neither she nor her husband necessarily realized it or anticipated the effects. The lace around her collar you can see replicated in these sort of billowing lace cuffs, although her sleeves now end at her elbows rather than at her wrist. And in fact, there's a lot more flesh on display than in the portraits of women we've seen before. The waist is worn much more high, and it doesn't look particularly tight. In fact, there's an excess of material which sort of gives this impression of quite a loose-fitting gown. Like the men's clothes, the impression of déchebelé is at the forefront. But it's an impression only. In fact, the bodices of these dresses often had bones sewn into them to create structure. And they were worn with stomachers, and these stomachers often were enhanced with whalebone or a hard canvas to stiffen them. So what seems a dress of quite easy leisure is actually almost as much for feet, perhaps, as those tightly buttoned up Elizabethan women. And we can see these fashions at play even more clearly in these two full-length portraits, one of Rachel de Rouvigny by Van Dyck and one by Adrian Hanneman of Mary Lucas. And Hanneman was an artist who had very close links to Van Dyck and was very influenced by him. So let's take this painting of Mary Lucas first, the Hanneman. You can really see that stomacher at play here and how it's sort of holding her in. She's also wearing those big sort of voluminous sleeves, the almost too revealing, in this case, plunging neckline, you feel like she's about to pop out. The shimmering satin fabric in this very fashionable pale colour, which the most stylish women at the court would wear. Although this one you can see a sort of delicate embroidery, you can see a sort of patterning all across it. Like Henrietta Maria, her hair sits in ringlets around her face and then it's sort of loosely held up at the back. And she wears the Queen's favourite jewels, pearls, in her ears, around her neck, in her hair. As we saw in that Elizabethan courtier image, Lucas is mimicking the Queen in her style. The monarch always leads the fashion. And again, in this painting, we can see that impression of dishabille, but if we look closely, we can actually see a little more of the effort that has gone into giving the appearance of having made no effort at all. This fabric is so precariously balanced on her shoulders, and the stomacher is so tight around her waist, that whilst the impression of the pink sash around her is one of movement as it sort of flows out behind her, it's actually quite hard to imagine her moving and have the garments remain in place. Let's look again at this Van Dyck, Rachel de Rouvigny, who was known as Lady Risley. This is a tour de force of portraiture, surely one of the most astonishing paintings you could look at. In fact, the process of creation was in some ways not unlike Larkin, our curtain master, but for Van Dyck it was more to do with the fact that he was so in demand and had time constraints. So Van Dyck sitters would arrive for single hour-long sittings, and during this time he would do a basic sketch, but they, just like Larkin's sitters, would send on their clothes or perhaps leave clothes behind after the sitting. Again, we have this huge preoccupation with the way that the fabric operates in an image. And this painting also demonstrates the huge shift that portraiture and fashion had undergone during that previous century. So if we think back just now to that Antoinette Moore, the black doubleted noblewomen, and think about Rachel de Rouvigny, we can see a great deal of change has happened in this time. Now, this one was probably a posthumous painting. So Lady Risley died in childbirth in 1640, which is the year that the painting is dated. And in fact, that skull that sort of sits under her foot would seem to allude to her mortality. But she, in this death, is in the sort of ultimate dishabille. Her dress is basically falling off her shoulders, and you can see that sort of that slip underneath. But we ought to be wary of taking this portrait too literally as a symbol of fashion. We should remember that she has transcended the mortal world and she has taken on a sort of goddess-like quality. This dress is almost Grecian and held together at the shoulders with golden clasps. This fabric is a really brilliant blue, which is actually a little faded in comparison probably to what it would have been like when it was painted, this bright, shining thing. This is a kind of apotheosis painting, and she rises up to heaven on a cloud. But it actually looks forward to the way that women would be painted upon the Restoration in 1660, when clothes were often depicted falling off the sitters and even breasts became exposed, with very little hint of stomachers or corsets. So these images we've just looked at, these are markers of the Caroline court, but the civil war of the 1640s and the execution of Charles I in 1649 made way for a new regime and a new set of sartorial ideas. So the Puritan regime under Oliver Cromwell looked very badly on the decadence of Charles I and Henrietta Maria and their courtiers. It was deeply mistrustful of French fashions, which were Catholic fashions. It was time to cover up. But it wasn't quite this return to the buttoning up of Tudor England. There was a middle ground. So let's have a look now at this portrait of Penelope Russell, which is attributed to Jane Carlyle, who was the first English woman to work as a professional painter. We can see that this fashion is actually very typical of the time, and it's also very typical of paintings that we see by Carlyle, who was an artist who paid attention really to features. So we've looked a lot at Larkin, Van Dyck, painters whose attention was almost exclusively about fabric, to the point that the sitter is almost incidental. Carlyle, on the other hand, she paints every single strand of the hair in the sitter's ringlets, and you can sort of see the reflection of light in the sitter's eyes. She thinks much more about the face. This is not to say, however, that these people are individualized. Indeed, one of the ways that these paintings can kind of be readily associated with Jane Carlyle is that the faces are almost all the same, which is quite normal for portraits of this era. Carlyle's women have quite sort of pointed noses and chins, heart-shaped lips. They sit in a sort of three-quarter profile, but they sit from the viewer's left, which is perhaps a little unusual. As we've seen in other portraits, you usually get it from the other way. But even the dresses that the sitters wore were often the same. Carlyle dealt partly with the financial difficulties of being a royalist in the Commonwealth by offering a kind of stock image. So her signature was a very beautiful silver dress that several of her sitters are painted wearing. But this sitter is different. Carlyle knew the Russell family. This is probably a much more personalised portrait. In fact, in some ways, this dress looks back a little to that kind of Van Dyckian shimmering satin, but it has a much higher neckline and the bodice is sort of held together with embroidered clasps, and this is a very different fashion to what we've seen before. That this sitter is wealthy is clear from the fact that those clasps are embroidered with pearls. And again, she wears these sort of pearls in her ears, in her hair, all around her neck. Lots of this is a kind of leftover from the days of the Caroline court, whilst also demonstrating the shifts that have happened under the Commonwealth. Let's look for a moment at the background, sort of thinking away from the fashion for a second. The background is very pastoral, and in another life, Carlyle might have even been a landscape painter, so she was so gifted at painting nature. But this kind of background is something which was really taken on at the Restoration. You can see it in the works of artists such as Peter Lely, who basically took over as chief court painter when Charles II became king. In these Lely paintings, in the early Restoration, we can see some return to the Van Dyckian style of aristocratic negligence. So let's look at this image of Sir John Roome. So his hair now is all quite loose. It's probably not a wig in this situation, but wigs would become ostentatious aspects of display as the Restoration court got going. And we can see now that all gestures to the ruff really are gone. We don't even have a drop collar. Instead, we've got a sort of cravat, but this sort of shimmering satin doublet, which is even more billowing than before, is the height of fashion. Lace is absent, but the sort of fulsome cuffs are still there. So it's just a movement along, again, similar fashions, but progressing. But for women, the Restoration court was a place of loose fashion. The king's favourite mistress, Barbara Villiers, Lady Castlemaine, famously introduced a dress which would open from the front, and this was to provide the king easy access, basically. So clearly, Barbara Villiers wasn't wearing corsets and stomachers. And we can see from this image by Mary Beale from the 1680s, Mary Beale, who was the second Englishwoman to work as a professional artist, we can see this sort of the relaxed clothes of the wealthy classes. Now, again, we don't know who the sitter was, but she has these sort of pearls threaded through that beautiful blue sash on the dress, and that does suggest some wealth. She wears her hair in the sort of loose style with a curl over one shoulder, which was very popular at the court and was made particularly so by Mary of Modena, the Duchess of York, who was a future queen consort to James II. And in fact, this painting looks quite a lot like Mary of Modena. Let's look at the dress. So the arms here kind of look back to those French fashions of the early Stuart court, those slashed sleeves with the white fabric underneath. But all round, it's a much more gentle image. The gaze is very soft, and she has a sort of languorous look in her eyes. It was very fashionable at the time to be painted with this sort of faraway stare or gaze. Aristocrats now wanted to be seen as languid, elegant, refined, passive creatures. They represented a kind of ideal which is perhaps more akin to the way that we might view celebrities today. Aristocracy was no longer put on view as an exercise in endurance, as the Elizabethan courtiers would have had it. These aristocrats are saying, look at me, I'm so much more relaxed than you. It's still a power play, but it's a very different kind. Over these 100 years of portraits, these wealthy, powerful elite essentially did all want to present the same image, just in different ways. And it's an image which carries through across all of these centuries since. Even when the identities of the sitters have been lost, the image remains. Now this is power. Fashion as power, art as power. This power of display has endured. And these portraits, which have been handed down from the past, are documents of that past. We can see the evolution of high fashion, but also the histories of those courts, from the prim, buttoned-up Elizabethans, whose queen required a kind of decorum and chastity, especially from her women, with very sort of rigid courtly structures, Then we see that relaxing of courtly structures under James I, the kind of decadence of the reign and court of Charles I, that Puritan regime under Cromwell, and then the hedonistic culture of the restored merry monarch Charles II. These are styles, these are theatre pieces. These paintings tell us not about individuals, but in fact about the evolution of elite culture and cultural production. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Breeze, and thank you to everyone for joining us for this talk. Our next presentation will be a discussion on the politics of men's fashion with Dr. Peter McNeill and NGV curator Danielle Whitfield. We hope you enjoy.